Hi everyone, this is Tanya with Flying Dog Studio. Thanks so much for joining me for part 2 of my Lamy pen experience. If you watched part 1, you know that I used some India ink, which kind of froze up in my pen, dried within, just minutes, I would say. And I had to keep trying to fix it in order for it to work. So I was going to experiment with some new ink and did some research, and there were quite a few of you that gave me some advice, and I appreciate you so much. So while I made my final decision and was waiting for that ink to come in, I used the Lamy blue cartridge that came with my Lamy pen, and that's what you see me using here. Now you can tell that it works very well. I had put this cartridge in, I guess, the day before I actually did this little sketch in my sketchbook. I'm planning out for a larger piece that I hope to bring you later on in December, and you can see that it worked really well even a day or two after I had put the ink in the pen and used it for other things. So it did not dry out in the pen, worked extremely well. And I was a little sad that I ordered black ink because I enjoyed this blue ink so much. I'm more of a blue ink fan, but for what I do, if you're going to use a Lamy pen for art, and that's what I do, I am drawn to either brown, gray, or black. And so I did purchase some black ink, but I went ahead and did some of the pages in my sketchbook in the blue ink because I just like the blue ink so much. And I thought, well, I'm planning, so I'll just go ahead and use the blue ink for planning. So you can see it works very well. There was a little bit of a smear factor. I'm very bad about putting my hand on my work, so just know that it will smear if you are left-handed, or if you are right-handed like myself and draw right or come right on top of where you've been drawing with your hands. So, but I have, at this point, I have taken that cartridge out, and I'm going to clean my pen. And I have my water there, and I have the little converter that the ink goes in if you're not going to use a cartridge ink. And I mentioned in my last video, even if you're not going to use ink from a bottle, if you're just going to use cartridges, it's a good idea to purchase one of these little converters so that you can clean your pen occasionally. It just makes that job a little bit easier. And I wanted you to see that in the previous video, we cleaned it as it came from the factory, because they do use blue ink, that Lamy blue, to test the pens before they send them out. And this, because I had used the blue ink in this, it actually had quite a bit more blue ink in it than the test ink. So at this point I have cleaned it, and this is the ink that I decided on. It's called Noodler's ink. And being from the South and knowing what noodling is, I thought that was pretty funny. And I did do my research on this, and this was not a pigmented ink. Now here's a freeze frame if you want to take a look at the actual front of it, so you can get that down. It was 3 ounces black, made in the USA. And I had already ordered this, so I decided I would go ahead and use it. But for future use, I may try some of the other inks that you suggested. So keep putting those suggestions down below, because I am going to be using those. Now you can see the little converter has those 2 little prongs on it, and I slid it in and I went, wait, that's the wrong spot. So I pulled it out and I put it back in the right spot. I don't know that it matters much, but it just, you know, the smaller slot is where it goes. So now we're going to ink. It was very full, so I was very nervous that I was going to turn it over, because I'm extremely messy when I do things like this. But I made sure all the water was out of my pen. That's very important. Out of the converter, there was a little bit left, and you can see on the paper towel I did clean my tip. I'm very carefully putting that back on. The danger has passed. We're not going to spill it everywhere. So I'm just going to put this back together and then wipe off the tip of it. And we're going to do some trial runs with it just to see how it does. Now you're going to notice some change in lighting in my video, and that's because this is done over a several day period. I wanted to see if it was going to dry in the pen, or if it was something that I was going to be able to use. So I did use it on a project, but straight out of putting it in it works perfectly. So the pen is nice and clean. We have straight black ink. That makes me happy. And we're going to give it a few days. I am going to use it in a project, and I'll show you that in just a bit. But before we go on, I always like to do an ink check. I actually did pretty well. I only got it on one thumb and a little bit on a forefinger. So as you can see, the lighting has changed. This is several days later, and I'm going to try it and see if it works. And it works. Guys, this ink did not, Noodler's ink, did not dry in the pen. So I was very, very thankful for this. One thing that I did want to note, I am using the extra fine tip on this pen, and this is a 100% cotton paper. It's a 140 pound 100% cotton paper, and so it has a rough texture. And you'll notice that it's very hard when you're using an extra fine tip and you're using a rough paper to get a straight line. But I don't really mind on this because this was more of a loose drawing. I sketched out ahead of time, but I'm not going to follow all the lines. And again, this is a project. If you're interested in this one, I'm going to have this video coming out soon where you'll see the entire inking process. But just to show you how smoothly it writes a few days later on just regular paper straight out of my printer, I just pulled that off the printer. It works very, very well. So, and it's much smoother, and also the lines are a little thicker when you use a smoother paper. The ink, I think, has a chance to flow out better than it does on a rough paper, so that's what you're seeing there. Now again, this is an extra fine tip, and the tips are interchangeable. If you want to know how to do that, you can watch my first video, part 1 of this, and I'll link that down below where I do take the tip off and clean underneath it. Now we need to test to see if this is actually going to be waterproof. At this point, I had not tested it. So I have a scrap piece of, again, this is the cold press paper, but I'm using the back of it. That's why it looks a little more smooth. The back of it's a little smoother. And so we're going to test it in different amounts of time. So the top one where I wrote waterproof, that was about 10 seconds, and I'm using my Derwent water brush there. I need to get a little bit of water out and get it started. Okay, we're ready to go. And I'm just going to run it across. So there's a little bit of a bleed, but with any ink, whether you are using a fountain pen or you are using just one of the fine liners, whether you're using a Micron or a Prismacolor, whatever you're using, there is a drying time for ink. So you never want to come back in with fresh ink and go over the top of it. So that was about 10 seconds, I estimated. And the lines underneath that, we went a little bit longer, so probably it's about 20 seconds. They're not smearing when I touch it. But for my lefties, because I did have a left-handed person that said, oh, I wish I weren't left-handed. But if you'll notice, I went across and immediately it smeared. Now, I do write left-handed occasionally. I do art occasionally left-handed. And it depends on how you hold your pen. So you see there, that was about 30 seconds or so. So there's still a little bleed, but not as much as the first. This is a little bit longer, but I put more ink. So the more ink you have, the longer drying time you're going to need, because I did these at the same time. So the top one bled a little bit more than the bottom one. So more ink, more drying time. You need to keep that in mind. But for left-handers, I wouldn't hesitate to get this ink or to try out one of these Lamy pens. Again, these are one of your less expensive fountain pens, and I think they're worth the money. It's a very good pen. It writes very smoothly. I've been very pleased with it. Now, this is for another project. I have several projects going. In an upcoming video where I'm going to be swatching some colors from a Derwent set, and this has been on there for a couple of days. And I'm going to zoom in so you can see. Same ink. It has been on the paper a couple of days, and it's not bleeding. So I was very, you see some, it's not really bleeding. It's just, again, this is 100% cotton paper, so you're seeing the fibers move back and forth, but the ink itself did not bleed. So I have found an ink that is wonderful, Noodler's ink. I would give it about a 24-hour drying time before I used water on it. So thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.